The image is so familiar, it barely registers anymore. A woman in a shirtwaist dress, hair set, lipstick on, standing in a kitchen that gleams. The counter is clean. The children are dressed. Dinner is either already planned or already started. She looks composed. She looks content. She looks, above all else, like a woman who has everything under control. That image was printed on magazine covers, filmed in television commercials, used to sell refrigerators and floor wax and cake mix. It became the shorthand for an entire era. And for decades, people looked back at it and assumed it was basically true. That mid-century American housewives had figured something out. That the simplicity of the role, the clear purpose, the domestic order, produced a kind of inner calm that modern women, with all their choices and complications, had somehow lost. But the image was not a photograph of reality. It was a performance of it. And underneath the pressed dress and the scrubbed sink, something else entirely was happening. The women who lived inside that picture were not serene. They were under pressure of a kind that rarely got spoken out loud, because speaking it out loud was itself considered a kind of failure. The home was their domain, which meant that if anything went wrong inside it, the children, the marriage, the meals, the mood of the household, that was on them. There was no off-season, no clocking out, no performance review that ended with a raise or a promotion. There was only the next morning and the morning after that, each one structured around the needs and schedules of everyone else in the house. If you enjoy finding the honest history behind the polished stories, subscribe before we go further. And while you're here, where are you watching from? Do you remember a woman in your family who always seemed perfectly composed on the outside, and you never quite knew what it cost her? The post-war years in America came with a particular kind of cultural pressure around domesticity. The war had ended, the men had come home, and the women who had spent years working in factories and offices were largely expected to step back, not because they wanted to. Surveys from the early 1950s showed that a significant number of women who had worked during the war years wanted to continue. At the time, the jobs were there. The capability was absolutely there. But the cultural machinery was moving hard in the other direction. Women belonged in the home. The home was where they were needed. The home was where they would find their fulfillment. What that meant in practice was a life of tremendous physical labor dressed up as natural feminine instinct. Laundry, cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, shopping, mending, organizing, entertaining, all of it was described not as work but as a calling. To name it as exhausting was to suggest you were doing it wrong, or that you didn't love your family enough, or that you were somehow built incorrectly for the role you had been assigned. The homes themselves were often isolating in ways that are easy to underestimate now. Suburban expansion was pulling families away from extended networks. A woman might spend the majority of her day without another adult to speak to. The telephone existed, but long distance was expensive, and local calls carried their own social accounting. You did not want to be seen as a woman who gossiped or complained. You kept your troubles inside the house where they lived, and the house had to look like those troubles did not exist. There was a standard being held. Neighbors noticed. Husbands commented. Mothers-in-law observed. The cleanliness of the kitchen, the behavior of the children at the grocery store, the way a woman looked when she opened the front door. All of it was legible information about whether she was doing her job. And her job had no written manual, no objective measure, and no finish line. It simply continued. This is not a claim that every woman of that era was miserable. Many found genuine meaning in homemaking, in raising children, in the rhythms of a well-run household. The skills involved were real, and the women who had them knew it. But meaning and pressure are not opposites. You can love something and still be worn down by the relentlessness of it. You can be committed to a life and still feel, somewhere underneath the commitment, a weight that you have no name for and no permission to put down. By the mid-1950s, that weight had become visible enough that the medical profession had started to take notice. Not to examine the conditions producing it, not to ask whether the structure of women's lives might itself be the source of the problem, but to treat the symptoms, to smooth out the anxiety, quiet the restlessness, and return women to a functional state so that the life they were living could continue. The woman with the perfect kitchen was not at peace. She was, in many cases, being managed, and the tools being used to manage her were just beginning to reach the market. In 1955, a pharmaceutical company called Wallace Laboratories introduced a drug called meprobamate to the American market. They gave it a brand name that was easy to say and easy to remember: Miltown. Within a year, it had become something the American pharmaceutical industry had never quite seen before. Doctors were writing prescriptions faster than pharmacies could stock the bottles. Department stores reported that women were asking about it over the counter. Celebrities mentioned taking it at dinner parties. A journalist at the time described it as the fastest-selling drug in American history, and the numbers bore that out. Miltown was not just a medication, it was a cultural moment. What Miltown did, in simple terms, was take the edge off. It was a tranquilizer. Not a sleeping pill, not a painkiller, but something designed to reduce anxiety, soften agitation, and make the nervous system feel quieter. For patients dealing with genuine clinical anxiety, it could offer real relief. But the population being targeted from almost the beginning was much broader than that. And the way it was being described, in advertisements, in medical journals, in conversations between doctors and their patients, pointed very specifically toward one group of people: women, married women, women at home. The pitch to doctors was framed in the language of that era's medicine, but the meaning underneath it was plain. There was a condition being named, loosely and variously, as housewife syndrome, or housewife neurosis, or simply nerves. It described a pattern that general practitioners were seeing with some regularity: women coming into the office not with a specific illness, not with a diagnosable physical problem, but with a gathering cluster of symptoms: anxiety, fatigue, low mood, a vague sense that something was wrong without being able to identify what, restlessness, irritability, difficulty sleeping, a feeling of being trapped inside a life that was supposed to feel like enough. The medical framework of the time did not look at that cluster of symptoms and ask what structural conditions might be producing it. It looked at the woman and identified the problem as hers. Her nervous system was dysregulated. Her anxiety was a malfunction. The solution was chemical correction. Miltown advertisements directed at physicians showed women, always women, in states of visible distress, gripping the kitchen counter, standing in a room full of children with a look of barely contained overwhelm. The caption beneath these images was always, "Relief is available." The drug would return her to a state where she could function, where she could manage, where the household could continue. What the advertisements did not say, and what no one in the marketing apparatus had reason to say, was that the conditions producing her distress were not a medical anomaly. They were the predictable outcome of a life built around confinement, performance, and the suppression of any desire that existed outside the role. Did your grandmother or mother ever mention nerve pills, something the doctor gave her to help with her nerves? To get through a hard stretch, to smooth out a rough patch? If she did, she was not unusual. She was part of a pattern so common that it barely raised questions at the time. Miltown did eventually fall out of favor, partly because its potential for dependence became harder to ignore, and partly because something more refined was already moving through the pipeline. The pharmaceutical industry had learned something important from Miltown's success. There was an enormous and largely untapped market in the domestic anxieties of women. The question was how to serve it more precisely, more sustainably, and with better optics. The answer arrived in 1963, when Hoffmann La Roche introduced diazepam under the brand name Valium. Where Miltown had been a blunt instrument, Valium was presented as something more calibrated. It worked on the central nervous system in a way that produced a softer, more sustained effect. Less sedation, more smoothing. Doctors received it enthusiastically and without hesitation. Patients reported that it took the sharp edges off daily life without making them feel foggy or detached. Prescriptions climbed quickly and kept climbing. The advertisements placed in medical journals through the 1960s and into the 70s are worth sitting with because they are unusually candid about exactly who they were for. One series of Valium advertisements showed a woman surrounded by the objects of her domestic life: a sink, a pile of laundry, a child's shoe, with a caption describing her as suffering from anxiety associated with the tensions of everyday life. Another showed a woman mid-30s, plainly dressed, with the description, She has no real complaints, but the symptoms persist. The message in every case was the same. The problem was not the sink or the laundry or the child's shoe. The problem was her response to them. This was not a fringe approach. This was mainstream medicine, backed by journal advertising, reinforced by pharmaceutical sales representatives visiting physicians' offices, and confirmed by the prescription patterns that followed. Across the late 1960s and into the 70s, Valium became the most prescribed drug in the United States. At its peak, American physicians were writing roughly 60 million prescriptions per year, and the majority of those prescriptions were going to women, not because women were more fragile, not because women's nervous systems were structurally more prone to dysfunction, but because women were being seen by doctors who had been handed a framework that identified female distress as a medical problem to be corrected, and a product that promised to correct it. The cultural image of the calm housewife did not emerge from genuine contentment. It was produced in part by a medical and pharmaceutical apparatus that had decided the right response to her unhappiness was to make it quieter. Miltown started that conversation. Valium turned it into policy. And while all of this was happening in doctors' offices and pharmaceutical boardrooms, at least one woman was sitting in her study writing down what she was seeing, and what she called it would change everything. In 1966, the Rolling Stones released a song that most people heard as a bit of rock and roll cheek. It had a driving, slightly anxious rhythm, and its subject was a suburban housewife reaching for a small yellow pill to get through her day. The chorus was almost cheerful about it. The pill helped her on her way, got her through her busy, dying day. The song was called Mother's Little Helper, and it was not a serious political statement. It was observed satire, a band of young men noticing something that was happening in ordinary households across Britain and America and putting a melody to it. What made the song land the way it did was that the observation was accurate. The woman reaching for the pill in the medicine cabinet was not a fictional character. She was a recognizable figure. She was, in many households, someone's actual mother. The cultural shorthand had caught up with the pharmaceutical reality. Valium was everywhere. Prescriptions were being written at a pace that had no precedent in American medical history. And the women receiving those prescriptions were not primarily women in psychiatric care or clinical treatment programs. They were women whose doctors had decided that their anxiety about their lives was a symptom requiring management. And that management meant a small pill, taken daily, indefinitely. The advertising that accompanied this period is some of the most revealing material in the history of pharmaceutical marketing. Valium's manufacturer, Hoffmann La Roche, placed full-page advertisements in the journals that American physicians read every month. And these advertisements, they were certainly not subtle. One of the most widely reproduced showed a woman in her late 30s, neatly dressed, looking slightly blank, with copy that described her condition as anxiety and tension associated with the everyday stress of her position. Her position, not her circumstances, not the structure of her days. Her position, as though the problem were a personality trait rather than a response to an environment. Another advertisement in wide circulation during the 1960s showed a woman described as a 35-year-old female who has never been able to adapt. She was depicted as resistant to the role of wife and mother. The suggested treatment was Valium. The implication was clear enough to require no translation. If a woman was struggling to accept the life she had been given, the appropriate medical response was to reduce her resistance to it. This is where the history becomes uncomfortable in a very specific way. The drug was real, the relief it offered was real for many women, and the distress it was treating was absolutely real. What was not real, or rather, what was being carefully avoided, was any examination of the source. Valium could soften the feeling of being trapped. It could not address the trap, and the medical system deploying it had no particular interest in making that distinction. Betty Friedan had made the distinction 2 years before Valium reached the market. Her book, published in 1963, identified what she called the problem that has no name. The formless dissatisfaction that educated, capable American women were feeling inside lives that had been designed entirely around the needs of others. Friedan had spoken to hundreds of women for the book. What she found was not clinical pathology. What she found was thwarted intelligence, suppressed ambition, and a cultural insistence that any woman who felt these things was somehow broken. The problem that has no name was not a neurological condition. It did not require a prescription. It required acknowledgement. And then, beyond acknowledgement, structural change. The kinds of change that took decades to arrive. But in the meantime, there were 60 million prescriptions a year. The women who took Valium in this period were not weak. They were not foolish. Many of them genuinely felt better on the medication, at least initially. The anxiety softened. The sharp edges of the day became more manageable. The accumulation of small pressures that had been building since breakfast felt, for a few hours, further away. If your doctor told you this was the appropriate treatment for what you were experiencing, and your doctor was the authority in the room, and the culture around you had no language for naming what was actually wrong, then you took the pill. You were grateful for the relief. You got through the day. Do you ever look at photographs of women from that era and wonder what they were actually feeling? The composed expression in the church photograph, the easy smile in the kitchen snapshot, the woman standing at the door to let someone in, hair set, house in order, looking for all the world like someone who has never had a difficult afternoon in her life. The pill does not show up in photographs. What the photographs also do not show is what happened over time. Valium is a benzodiazepine, which means it works by enhancing the effect of a neurotransmitter in the brain that reduces neural activity. It is also, with sustained use, dependency forming in a way that was understood by researchers well before it was communicated clearly to patients or even to many prescribing physicians. Women who had been taking it daily for months or years found that stopping was not a simple matter of deciding to stop. The withdrawal was real, anxiety that rebounded harder than before, sleep that collapsed, a nervous system that had reorganized itself around the presence of the drug and did not know how to function without it. The women who had been handed this medication as a solution to their domestic restlessness had, in a significant number of cases, become physically dependent on it. The problem that had no name had been given a pill instead of a diagnosis, a prescription instead of a conversation, and a chemical quieting instead of any real accounting of what was causing the noise. And the image held. The kitchen stayed clean in the photographs. The smile remained in the right place. The calm that the world had decided these women should project was, for many of them, being produced chemically. And the world had every reason to keep that arrangement exactly as it was. Dependency is a slow thing. It does not announce itself. It builds quietly in the background while daily life continues in the foreground. And the first sign of it is often not the drug itself, but what happens when the drug is absent. A woman who had been taking Valium for 2 years, prescribed by a doctor she trusted, for symptoms that had been described to her as a nervous condition, would not necessarily have thought of herself as someone with a dependency problem. She thought of herself as someone whose nerves required maintenance. The pill was part of the routine, the way the vitamins on the counter were part of the routine. The way the morning coffee was part of the routine. When physicians in the late 1970s and into the 80s began to confront what had happened, when the research became too clear to set aside and the patient accounts became too numerous to dismiss, what emerged was a portrait of a managed population, not managed toward health, managed toward compliance, toward functionality within a structure that had never been examined. The women who had been prescribed tranquilizers through the 50s, 60s, and 70s had not been treated for illness. Many of them had been chemically adjusted so that a life built around their suppression could continue to run smoothly. That is a hard sentence to sit with. It is also, based on the advertising, the prescription patterns, the documented medical framing of the period, and the accounts of the women themselves, an accurate one. The withdrawal process for long-term benzodiazepine users was difficult in ways the medical system had not prepared its patients for. Anxiety returned, often more severe than anything the woman had originally presented with. Sleep became disordered, mood destabilized. Physical symptoms appeared that had no obvious cause. Tingling, tremors, a hypersensitivity to light and sound that made ordinary rooms feel hostile. Women who went to their doctors reporting these symptoms were sometimes given more medication, The loop closed around itself. The solution had become the problem, and the problem was still being treated with the solution. Some women found their way through with help. Some found their way through alone, slowly, over months of deliberate reduction. Some did not find their way through at all. The full scale of long-term benzodiazepine dependency in mid-century American women has never been precisely measured, partly because the medical system that created the situation had limited institutional interest in auditing itself, and partly because the women most affected were not, by and large, women whose accounts carried much social weight. They were housewives, every single one of them. Their suffering had already been classified as a personal nervous condition once. It could be classified that way again. What the calm image of the 1950s housewife actually represented was not the resolution of female stress. It was the suppression of its visibility. The stress was present. The dissatisfaction was present. The exhaustion of a life built entirely around service to others. Without outlet, without recognition as labor, without permission to name itself as difficult, all of it was present. The pharmaceutical industry did not create those conditions, but it did identify them as a market, and it did offer a product that allowed the conditions to continue undisturbed, by making the women inside them more manageable. There is a reason this history matters beyond the period it describes: the targeting of women's emotional and psychological distress as a pharmaceutical opportunity did not end in the 1970s. The specific drugs changed. The diagnostic language evolved. The advertisements became more sophisticated, and in many cases moved directly to consumers rather than routing exclusively through physicians. But the underlying structure, identify female distress, frame it as a personal biological malfunction, offer a product that reduces its visible expression without addressing its source. That structure did not disappear, it updated. Antidepressant prescriptions in the United States have followed a strikingly similar gender pattern to the Valium years. Women receive them at roughly twice the rate of men. The marketing that surrounds anxiety and mood management continues to speak disproportionately to women. Through imagery, through language, through the particular problems it chooses to name as treatable. The wellness industry, which now runs in parallel to the pharmaceutical industry and often uses softer language about it, has built a substantial portion of its market on the daily management of female stress. Supplements, apps, rituals, routines, all of them oriented toward helping women feel calmer, inside lives that may simply be asking too much of them. This is not an argument against medication, or against treatment, or against the genuine relief that both pharmaceutical and wellness tools can offer people who need them. Some women needed Valium the way some people need any medication that addresses real neurological distress. The argument is narrower and more specific than that. It is that when a drug is being prescribed to an entire demographic, not because that demographic has a clinical condition, but because their environment is producing symptoms that are inconvenient to the people around them. That is not medicine, that is management. And management dressed as medicine has a way of lasting a very long time before anyone names it clearly. The women in those photographs were not fine. The pressed dress was real. The clean kitchen was real. The smile at the door was real. But what was also real, in a great many cases, was a pill bottle in the medicine cabinet, and a doctor who had decided that the problem was her nerves and not her life. What was real was a system that needed her to keep performing calm, and found a way to produce it chemically when the performance became too hard to maintain on its own. When you look at photographs of women from that era, really look at them, past the composition and the clothes and the careful presentation, it is worth asking what they were carrying that the image was not designed to show. The fatigue that got up before anyone else in the house, the ambitions that were never given a room to live in, the frustration that had been named a symptom and handed back as a prescription, the daughters who watched and absorbed and did not always know what they were absorbing. The calm was not evidence that they were at peace. It was evidence of how much they were asked to contain, and how many different forces, medical, cultural, pharmaceutical, and domestic, had organized themselves around making sure that the containing looked effortless. The wisdom worth recovering from that era is not the performance of composure, it is the recognition of what it cost. And the habit worth building now is the one those women were never quite allowed to practice. The honest naming of what is actually hard before someone hands you something to make it quieter. If the hidden histories of women's lives matter to you, subscribe before you go. There are more stories waiting, the ones that were smoothed over, dressed up, and handed back as something simpler than they were. Every one of them is worth bringing back into the light.